Hey everyone, it's Reed. Before we get started, today's conversation is going to take us in a new direction, and I think that's what we need more of. I hope that when you come to the home front, you're being challenged in the things that you've thought about, given opportunities to think about things in a new way, and start to join the community of those of us that know that things can and should and must be better as we move into the future. And now, on with the show. Welcome back to the home front. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I'm joined by Grace Blakeley, a staff writer at Tribune Magazine and author of several books, including her latest, Vulture Capitalism, Corporate Crimes, Backdoor Bailouts, and the Death of Freedom, which is available wherever fine books are found. She also writes regularly on her Substack newsletter. You can find my earlier conversation with Grace about her book in the show notes. Today, she's coming to us from the UK. Grace, welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me again. It's so great to be here.
I'm also joined by Evelyn Quartz. Evelyn is a Capitol Hill staffer and communications expert and author of her own Substack newsletter, where she writes about the failure of elite politics and the search for something more honest. She's coming to us from the great state of Oregon. Evelyn, welcome back.
Hi, Reed. Hi, Grace. Thanks for having me.
All right. So, guys, we are stretching from the Pacific to the Channel Coast. Here we are, guys. So we're going to save the world 9 time zones apart. So let me start with a not insignificant question. Grace, I'll start with you. There's so much talk about where we are politically in the world. Are we experiencing a revolution or a renewal of fascist ideologies? Are we authoritarian? Are we totalitarian? The question that doesn't get asked enough, and especially by someone like me who has considered themselves, quote, part of the pro-democracy movement, what does that mean? What does democracy mean? Because I don't think anybody really knows, and if they know, I don't think they often agree.
One of the things I first learned when doing my political philosophy course was the idea of an essentially contestable concept, which is a concept that can mean so many different things to so many different people that you spend as much time debating the actual meaning of the term as you do, trying to situate it in wider context. And, democracy is one of those things as well. But I think it's important to note that different political and intellectual traditions understand this term democracy in different ways. So what we usually mean when we talk about democracy is liberal democracy. And so, this is a particular political system that emerges with liberalism, is associated not just with kind of elected representatives, so not just with kind of voting in elections, but also with a specific set of kind of individual rights, the separation between different areas of state, so, between legislature, executive, and judiciary. It's a kind of structure of governance more than anything else, which involves limited citizen participation in the machinery of government, basically. Now, that's one way of looking at democracy. It's the way that we usually understand it. And it's why when, for example, Donald Trump attacks the judiciary, or when politicians, as they are in the UK, attack our right to protest and freedom of speech, we say that's an attack on democracy, because those are things that we have come to associate with liberal democracy. But that's not the only understanding of democracy that exists. So the tradition that I come from, the kind of socialist tradition, the democratic socialist tradition, says that liberal democracy is a kind of half-filled promise. So you have a limited amount of democracy in the political sphere, so within government, kind of in the realm of electoral politics. But the economic sphere is kind of artificially separated from politics, and then kind of representation within economic institutions is kind of rigidly limited. So you get democracy in politics, but you don't get critically economic democracy. And what all this means, and it's the argument that I outlined in my book, is that, in reality, in a capitalist economy, economics and politics aren't separate. So if you have an oligarchic, monopolistic, highly unequal economy that is controlled by massive multinational corporations and financial institutions, that power isn't just going to stay nicely in its area. These guys aren't just going to be like, okay, well, we're in the economy, we're just going to play over here. They're going to find ways of kind of translating their economic power into political power. And that's exactly what they do. I think this was slightly more controversial an argument when I brought the book out. But, in like the last year, we've literally seen one of the world's most powerful billionaires take over part of the machinery of the American state. And lots of liberals look at this and think, this is an attack on, the principles of democracy, because this person wasn't elected and they're being given all this untrammeled control over state institutions. But the bigger issue came before that, which was the fact that we had this one guy who was able to amass so much economic power that he was ultimately obviously able to translate that into political power. So that idea of democracy, when you look at it from the kind of socialist tradition, is like, yes, you need political democracy, and actually you need more political democracy than we have right now, but you also need economic democracy. You need participation by workers in decisions about production. You need ownership of production by workers, and you need economic institutions that give people a voice and a say.
So, Evelyn, to that end, I want to go to where Grace discussed the idea of unfettered capital being highly impactful on democracy, small d democracy itself, because we have seen that. And I think that we could talk about Elon Musk, we could talk about corporate PACs. I mean, just in my experience, in my lifetime, it's amazing how little an American politician actually costs, right? A $5,000 PAC check, usually do it. Right. I mean, and oftentimes, just as an aside, when they go to jail for corruption, it's always for like $8,700. But the downstream effect of that, Evelyn, is so in 2022, here in the U.S., only 44% of voters participated in the midterm elections. Is that democracy? If a significant chunk of more than half the country says, I don't care, or it's not worth it, or it doesn't matter, is that a democracy?
No, and I don't think America's been a democracy for a long time, right? I think my issue with the pro-democracy movement that we have here is that it treats the problem like Trump as the singular problem. And I think a real pro-democracy movement would look at the conditions that created Trump as the problem and try to address that. But instead, and I think this serves sort of the elites who control our liberal democracy, our institutions, it becomes a project of protecting democracy kind of in name only. And I think it's actually more like a civic religion than it is democratic, right? We're asked to like have faith in institutions. We're told that democracy is sacred, but all we do is vote and go to these symbolic protests, which I've been pretty critical of, which I think upholds this idea, this kind of ideology that serves the liberal class, which is that the system is fine. It just needs better caretakers. And I think that Trump takes the mask off a system that has been undemocratic for a long time, right? He's unapologetic about it helping oligarchs. He's brought in Elon Musk. He's unapologetic about being racist towards immigrants. But when you look at his policies, and this is maybe a little controversial to say, but like his tax cuts for rich people, his like hawkish policy on the Middle East, his deregulatory policies, these are all things that George Bush did in some way too, right? And now you have this kind of pro-democracy banner of people who largely also supported and helped create the conditions for Trump, telling us that, just kind of give us the keys back in a way to the system. And to me, like that is so undemocratic, and it's just insulting to the American people that we're going to fall for this again, right? And so I think that real democracy would look like changing, kind of reimagining the role of the state, rebuilding the social contract. So we actually have the state that guarantees like material conditions, not, our private employers, so people can have more freedom to move around. I think reimagining the role of economic freedom, like what Grace was saying, to not just being sort of freedom from these institutions and from each other, but to being freedom to have actual material opportunities in life, things like housing, healthcare, paid time off, these things that are guaranteed by our employers, but really should be guaranteed by the state. So I think that like a real pro-democracy movement would address those conditions. That's where we need to go. And any of this pro-democracy as it exists now is really a distraction from that.
Grace, one thing that Evelyn talked about, and I think this is true, and I think you've written about this with Labour in the UK now in Keir Starmer's government, is what we have under Donald Trump vis-a-vis oligarchs or corporate power, not that different than it was under Joe Biden, not that different than it was under Barack Obama. And you could make an argument that a lot of that peeling back of the New Deal protections for individual Americans by keeping some necessary clamps on big institutions. For me, Glass-Steagall comes to mind, the separation of commercial and investment banking, that what Reagan brought to power ideologically, Clinton really put into practice. So to Evelyn's point, it's not as if the Republicans and the Democrats have had a different argument over the last 45 years. It's really that they said just enough different things to get 50% plus one of those people that show up to give them power for a certain amount of time.
Yeah, and it's not that surprising because they are being paid by different sections of the capitalist class, but they're both being paid by the capitalist class, right? These are people who are being elected on the back of donations from fossil fuel companies, financial institutions, big tech, whatever. So it's natural that the policies that they pursue are going to be much more aligned with the interests of capital. Now, I'll come on in a bit to how Donald Trump has pursued that mandate because, I think there's been a lot of speculation that actually Donald Trump is somehow breaking with the interests of big business because he nearly crashed the global economy. And I think that's misguided. But to kind of come on to this discussion as to, how we've got to this point, obviously the natural thing to think of, you alluded to Reagan there, is this idea of neoliberalism, right? So the change in our economic and political systems that came in during the 1980s when you had politicians like Reagan and Thatcher talking about, free markets and shrinking the size of the state and that sort of thing. And I think a lot of the problem with the debate that we have right now is that we really took the kind of neoliberal economists and politicians at their word when they told us this is a battle between government and business. That's been the kind of dividing line in our politics for a really long time now. And basically what the Republicans and the Democrats have done, same with the Conservatives and Labour here, is place themselves slightly on one side of that line. So like we are more pro-government, but we're still pro-business, but we are more pro-government. Or we're more pro-business, but we still want a bit of government, but we're actually mostly pro-business. And we've allowed this just ridiculous debate to dominate our politics when everyone knows, if you ask the average person on the street, who do the politicians work for, it's not like they're out in the streets fighting. Well, I guess Donald Trump is now fighting Elon Musk, but only because they disagreed after working together so closely.
Because you put two meth-addled tigers in a cage, they're going to fight.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's not like they're, fighting Wall Street every day or fighting the fossil fuel companies or whatever. They're working very, very closely together. And yeah, in the book, I kind of outline all the ways in which big corporations, powerful financial institutions, and governments work together to basically plan capitalist economies. And, my argument, we spoke about it before, Reed, is that we don't live under a system of free markets. We live under a system of kind of centralized planning, capitalist planning that the public and private sector are both very involved in. So if that's the case, then what was neoliberalism really all about? Well, if it wasn't about shrinking the state and freeing the market, which it wasn't, because we have huge, powerful states that tell everyone what to do, take away our right to protest, abduct people in the streets if you're in the US, and which give out, massive subsidies to big corporations. And it certainly didn't create freer markets because we have monopolies, we have, no real competition in a lot of areas. What it did instead was rebalance class power in society. So if you have this very schematic picture of a capitalist economy as the people who own stuff, the people who work for a living, and then the people who manage those corporations on behalf of the people who own stuff, then you can see that the owners and the managers, i.e. the ones with the political and economic power, have seen their power and wealth grow exponentially over the course of, really since the 1980s, whereas everyone else has been screwed over. And, for a while, the fact that they were being screwed over was disguised because they were able to take out huge loans to buy houses, which were increasing exponentially in value, and made them forget that their wages actually weren't increasing at a rate that they had done in the past, or that they weren't unionized.
Right. Or buy a $5 DVD player at Best Buy on Black Friday.
Exactly, right? There are all these different ways that we were convinced to disidentify with the idea of being workers, and the idea of our prosperity as being attached to our wages. And that is a bargain, and is associated with a lot of things that Donald Trump criticizes, actually, like neoliberal globalization. But it is a bargain that has withstood successive presidencies, withstood successive administrations, the same core principles, which are basically about expanding corporate power and undermining not just the wealth of the working classes, but people's capacity to come together and organize to take control of their lives, whether that's in unions, whether it's through kind of participatory democracy, whether it's by participating in democratic processes as citizens. All of that's kind of been just shredded. and replaced with this hierarchical, top-down, centralized model of capitalism that both the Democrats and the Republicans are on board with. It's just that they have different particular vested interests that they're going to immediately hand power over to as soon as they get into power. Like for the Dems, a while ago, it was the tech bros in Silicon Valley who loved the Dems and they were like, we're going to do loads of stuff for you. Then Lena Khan comes along and says, oh, actually, maybe we should do a tiny bit to maybe stop them being so powerful. And also, you get this big alliance between the tech companies and the fossil fuel companies. And the Republicans have always been very, very close with the fossil fuel companies. And that then starts to switch that over. But, you know, the Democrats have parts of finance. They have like some of the bigger, more like long-standing professional services businesses and all that sort of stuff. Republicans have fossil fuels and now tech, whatever. That's the big difference. It's just like, who are their friends in the capitalist class rather than whether or not they're supporting market or state. And actually, it's just this one big cabal and they're all basically working together.
To that end, I think about if Kamala Harris had been elected, we wouldn't be seeing a lot of the things we're seeing, obviously. But you know what we probably would be seeing, to Grace's point, are Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan executives as, you know, economic advisors, the assistant to the president for this, the Treasury Secretary, all that. So it's not as if Kamala Harris had won. And to your point, Grace, also, that I just want to go back to Lena Khan for a second. It was Reed Hoffman and Mark Cuban, two of the biggest donors to the Democratic side last year, who both let the mask slip a little bit and say, if Harris gets elected, the first thing she should do is fire Lena Khan. And I was like, okay. Billionaire's gonna billionaire.
Yeah, and I actually think this started in a way with Obama. So Obama ran this like amazing kind of populist, economic, driven message campaign. And I think a lot of people, the first time in a long time, got really excited about that and maybe thought that this guy's going to change things. And then he came, dealt with the financial crisis by hiring, the people who used to run the big banks to craft the recovery plan. So you have this broken promise. And I think what happens with that is politics gets moved from like the realm of the political, where power is disputed, into the realm of the aesthetic, and it becomes like vibes. And I think that has become what we're seeing. And the Democrats kind of just thought, okay, let's take that. When you talk about politics sort of in this aesthetic way, and it's actually just like the way that they talk about Mamdani. So the sort of liberal professional class, if you listen to what they're saying about how he won, they say, oh, he made great videos. Oh, his digital presence was incredible. Like, he's charismatic, he's young, and the young people like that. That's a form, in my opinion, of like depoliticizing what he actually is trying to do.
Well, I think in diminishing it, frankly.
Yes.
It just happened to be the tactics and the tools he made good use of, as opposed to what he was saying.
Yeah, and there's a time, like there's a place for that in a good campaign, right? But by saying that that's the only way that he won, you're completely ignoring what that campaign was actually about. And I think the difference between Obama and Mamdani is that Obama had the oligarchs in his tent and Mamdani doesn't, right? And they're freaking out. Like, the mask has totally slipped. Bill Ackman posted on Twitter, I don't know if you saw it, this kind of unhinged, like really long post about how he's going to give hundreds of millions of dollars to anyone who wants to run. And he's like, I'm on the WhatsApp group chats with all the billionaires, and like, we'll get it sorted for you. It's just like, it's an unbelievable like panic. And I think it tells you everything you need to know about if this country is a democracy. And the fact that they couldn't buy this one election, I think it's both hopeful, but it also really shows just how much corporate capture has taken over our politics, not just with Trump, but in general.
I want to talk about the election in New York City as a test case, and an admittedly small test case, given the fact that it is a highly Democratic city, and this was a Democratic primary. But it was utilizing a new system that deprioritizes the necessity of money. It makes it more than a binary choice. You saw Mamdani and the other guy, right, go on Stephen Colbert together in New York City and say, rank each of us, right? Which is what that system, that ranked choice voting system, it always takes a little bit to work out. And it's always a little bit different everywhere, but it worked, which was the person who was most likely to be supported by the most number of people in that particular election rose to the top. People didn't know what they were getting with Eric Adams. They didn't quite understand how to work it yet. I want to go back to the Obama comparison. People are like, oh, Obama, Facebook, data, all this. Like, Obama could have won with an airplane and Mrs. Obama. right? Mamdani won because he was the better candidate who ran a good campaign, and Andrew Cuomo is an asshole who ran a terrible campaign after those same billionaires like Bill Ackman said, just hang out, we'll take care of it. He's like, okay, great, I guess I can do this, and it didn't work. And now, Grace, just this little change, right? Just this little change has caused the Republicans or the right to flip out about the fact that he's a communist and he's an anti-Semite, and the left to say, we don't need free grocery stores and we don't need free buses. And I love this idea of the mask slipping, right? Like it all slipped at the same time. I talked to a buddy of mine who's a conservative former member of Congress. He's like, I don't like the socialism. Look, socialism as a concept doesn't offend me, right? It doesn't offend me. But I said, let me ask you something, man. Like, is what we're doing now working? And he just started laughing.
What you're alluding to about the mask slipping, it holds true in so many different places. It holds true in the UK. It holds true across Europe, which is that the single greatest fear of the people who have been managing this, multicolored version of the same economic and political model for the last 50 years is that there will be a genuine anti-elitist populist candidate, right? Because what Trump managed to do extremely successfully at the last election and when he was first elected was harness the rage that people feel towards a basically corrupt and self-satisfied elite. But rather than calling out their kind of economic dominance and their links to particular sections of capital, he instead just highlighted their cultural characteristics and was like, this is the kind of typical liberal metropolitan elite telling you what to do thing, right? And there is some truth in that. We've seen a lot of that, particularly among I would call liberals, right? Which is the kind of middle of the road, centrist, moderate people.
Ugh. I hate all of those words. I'm not liberal, but
exactly.
I hate moderate and centrist. I just hate those words.
No one knows what it means.
And that's why they like it.
Yeah, but the people who have been in charge of kind of nominally social democratic parties in recent years. And the problem with that, as we're seeing, is that you can mount this really effective cultural critique of elitism, basically. But unless you actually take on the root of that elite power, which is fundamentally at its core a form of economic and to an extent political power, then the mask is inevitably going to slip, right? Because you are going to end up doing, the big, beautiful bill that takes away people's healthcare and gives massive tax cuts to corporations. And as you were saying, Evelyn, it's like, for as long as there's no threat, as long as there's no outsider, you can just continue to rely on vibes and say, I'm the anti-elite candidate because, I'm going to bring back your jobs and I'm going to attack China and working people hate, I don't know, immigrants or whatever, and pretend to align yourself with this very warped and one-sided view of what the working class allegedly looks like. But as soon as someone comes in and says, okay, well, I've been speaking to working class people in my neighborhood, and they say that they want a rent freeze and they want healthcare and they want unionized jobs. And then suddenly you're like, okay, well, actually, no, the guys that I've been speaking to say they just want to deport more people and they want me to build a wall and go to war with Iran. And then suddenly the whole thing is exposed because everyone's like, well, that's absurd. Obviously, what the vast majority of people want is to be able to just live healthy, happy, secure lives. But at this point in time, a lot of them just want to be able to live. And when a candidate comes in and says, I am going to do everything in my power to meet that, then suddenly the anti-elite message of the elite is exposed because they're always going to prioritize their economic interests over their alleged, disdain for the kind of corrupt elite class that they came in to kind of drain the swamp or whatever. And that's what we're seeing happening right now. And we're seeing it as well with Democrats who have the same sort of vibes-based, nice capitalism works message. The big threat to their power is, again, when someone comes in and says, okay, that's all well and good, but what are you actually going to do for people? And they can't say anything.
The people I think that are least likely to be swayed by that argument by a big D Democrat are younger voters. I said to somebody the other day, younger voters, Americans, or really any young person in the world, since 2001, if you look out at the pond, it's just nothing but black swans, right? There's no white swans to be seen. So like every 2 years, there's some other debacle. So it's not surprising that people of your generation, and frankly of my daughter's generation, who are on the other end of Gen Z, are like, you're all full of shit. None of you know what you're talking about. None of you care what I care about. You don't know how to talk to me. Then you come and you tell me you want to be quote unquote authentic. And I'm like, get away from me. I want nothing to do with you. Then they show just a little bit of power, and God forbid it be college educated or upper income young people who are voting for something different. And by definition, that makes it illegitimate because God forbid they participate and have a voice in their elections. And it seems to me that with, the Republicans, I mean, I grew up in that party. They're gone, right? So just don't worry about them. But the Dems have a real problem, and I don't want to make this a political strategy discussion. I want to make it a philosophical discussion, and it funnels into what Grace is talking about too, which is you could have a situation where, everybody's like, oh, in 2026, the Dems are going to get it back. I'm like, why? You think that the young people who understand who you really are and the working class people who stayed home in droves last year are going to be like, oh, yeah, you've changed, because they haven't. And you look at it every time they say something. There's no like, we're going to take power and we're going to try and do X. It's Donald Trump is bad. OK, got it. Didn't work last year, barely worked in 2022, barely worked in 2020. And to me, it's because, back to the sort of tentpole of our conversation, they're not different, and voters know it.
Well, you think about the world that young people are inheriting right now, right?
And I'm sorry, by the way.
The job market is very precarious, right? You kind of bounce from job to job. The benefits, at least in the US, don't come with you. So you need a job to have healthcare. And our climate has become like an existential threat that young people, it's so overwhelming that I think young people have chosen cynicism in a way to deal with that. But I think like looking at the way that the liberal class kind of treats and interprets the Mandani victory, it's not that he's talking about these material conditions which young people care about, right? That's why they like him, because he's talking about affordability. He's talking about like the climate. He's talking about making life more stable. And to interpret that as just, oh, he's charismatic and he has good videos is an insult to young people. And I think that the way that they turn around and say, of course we don't believe you. And you look at Alyssa Slotkin, who's kind of the heir apparent to Kamala Harris, who just did a speech at the Center for American Progress, which is a very sort of central liberal think tank in the US. And she is, I think, the ultimate sort of technocratic expert. She's a she used to work at the CIA. She's like a defense-minded person, right? She worked in the Obama administration. She has all these kind of elite credentials. And her plan, she used this analogy of like a war plan for the economy. And it's basically like economic precarity is like a threat to our system's stability. It's not bad because it's immoral, right? It's bad because it threatens our ability to maintain power. And that's how they're going to see this next election. It's so insulting to people who have been sounding the alarm for decades, right? That this stuff, they look out the window, right? You're saying earlier, Reed, nothing changes. And so, yeah, I think it's a real ticking time bomb for the Democrats. And I think that instead of seeing saving the party as sort of a noble cause, I think there needs to be more movement outside of the party.
I think it's not just young people either, right? Who are like
Exactly,
really mobilized by this message. I watched a video the other day, which was More Perfect Union did this video where they went to a constituency somewhere. I don't know exactly where, but it was the place that had distinguished itself by consistently voting Democrat and voting for Bernie in primaries and then voting for Trump.
Right.
And it's like, these are people who are so angry with a political elite that has abandoned them, that has left them often like without jobs, living in one way or another, some form of poverty, has like decimated their communities. And the social fabric that has bring them together has left them with the legacy of things like, opioid epidemics and public health crises and environmental breakdown and all of these other issues.
And just general apathy and hopelessness. None of it matters.
Exactly. Like that anger builds and swells up. And every year that these things get worse, you think these guys need to answer for something, right? And so first you think, okay, well, this Bernie Sanders guy seems to be talking sense. Like he's saying we're going to take on the elites and, maybe he's going to start like investing in me as a worker and supporting me and all that sort of stuff. He was like close with unions and would maybe like restore workers' rights in some way. But then he gets defeated by the democratic establishment, basically, multiple times.
Yeah, both in 16 and in 20.
Yeah. And anyone who comes through with that message receives the same treatment. So it is deeply unsurprising that you then think, right, okay, no one in a position of power is going to allow someone who has my interests at heart to gain a position of political authority. I don't necessarily think that these people who went from Bernie to Trump think Trump is going to save me. You know, he's going to like do all these amazing things. They might think maybe he'll bring some jobs back to the US and they, you know, they might have been taken in by that message. But the main thing is just like they are so angry at this political class that has spent decades ignoring them. And this guy basically comes in and says, I will make you feel strong and powerful again. And I will give a kicking to the elites that have treated you terribly for the last several decades. And even if that is the only thing that they get from that, you know, even if it's not like you don't believe that Trump is actually going to alleviate poverty, or you know that he is going to give massive tax giveaways to big business because that's what he's done before, you at least get that sense of esteem and power that comes from basically pissing off like the Democratic establishment and the New York Times and like all of these people who have just consistently made it their life's mission to ignore what the vast majority of people in your country actually want.
I've said this several times because I think it's an important thing that has gone missed, which is when Trump expresses that level of humiliation and separation, it comes from personal experience. Now, it's being a guy from Queens who wanted to be a guy from Manhattan, but it's the same emotion, which is I wanted to be someplace, I wanted to be something, and they said, no, you're not good enough. And then the other part, Grace, about the elites, and let me just take on the elites for a second, although I probably am one, is this idea of, well, they vote against their interests. Don't they know better? And I'm like, how much more paternalistic could you be? They're voting for their interests because you haven't paid attention to them. Well, they just need to understand how important expertise is. You wouldn't want an amateur brain surgeon, would you? And I'm like, somebody actually said that in an event I was at. And I'm like, I don't think anybody wants an amateur brain surgeon. I don't think that's like the best analogy you could use. But I'll tell you this. I mean, for me, on the left, I think the strike point is elitism. Just from my experience, from what I have seen is we have systematically, and Grace, this is your area of expertise, we in this country over the past 50 plus years have systematically devalued socially, culturally, and ultimately financially the idea of work, right? The idea of somebody who's got to go to work every day, to your point, not the head office, as you call it, not the managerial class, not the ownership class, but it's like, well, you know, people at McDonald's, you know, they can make $7.25 an hour. Why? Well, because it's a first job. Well, what if it's not their first job? Right? Like, what if it's their job, one of three that they have to have because they get paid $7.25 or whatever it is? And then let me just say this, and you guys might have a different perspective on it. I look at this politically. One person said, well, we have to deal with the student debt crisis. I said, okay, let me just take it from, not from whether or not college is too expensive or the college loan system is broken in so many ways, but 68% of Americans don't go to college. So culturally, what you're saying is when you put that up on a pedestal is, I want to take care of the people that are like me, not like you. Secondly, when I made this suggestion, if you want to get rid of the student debt crisis, why don't we break the system that created it? And people are like, well, we can't do that. And I said, why? Well, you'd have to take on the banks and the universities. Like, great. Two great opponents. People would love that. Right? And it looks like a second head's grown out of my shoulders.
I think that point around like education is really important, and it cuts to the heart of what neoliberalism in terms of ideology was actually about, right? So, you know, the way I conceptualize neoliberalism is basically a power grab by basically political and economic elites who figured out very effective ways of working together to create an economy that worked much more effectively for them. But the only way to do that was to crush and break up the collective institutions that had allowed people to resist their power up till that point. Now, there were very obvious ways they were doing that, like, for example, making it illegal in some places to unionize. But the other much more subtle and much more effective way was to create this hyper-competitive individualistic culture. And education was such a central part of that. You know, in the UK over here, Tony Blair, who was our kind of like new Labour, like Clinton type figure. One of his slogans was education, 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 right? The idea was that we don't want to reduce inequalities between different social groups. Instead, we believe in meritocracy because we believe society is one big market. And the whole idea is to separate the wheat from the chaff. The good should be able to rise to the top, and, you know, the bad should be able to sink to the bottom. And the problem isn't that we have millionaires and billionaires, isn't that we have entrenched privilege. It's that there isn't enough kind of movement up and down this spectrum, right? So education was supposed to be the way that, you know, the deserving poor could basically climb their way out of being working class. And you speak to these people. I've actually been interviewing people from my book recently who've come from extremely working class backgrounds, go to elite universities, and they're like, I spend my whole life feeling like crap. Because, yeah, I'm in this education system with these people, but I don't have the same like social background as them. I don't know how to integrate with them. I always feel like I'm not good enough. I feel like I have to work 10 times harder. And then when I get into work, like I feel like an alien. And then the people who are excluded from this also feel like losers because they're like, I didn't get to go to university. I didn't get an education. And that must be my fault. It must be because I'm stupid, because we have this market system where if you're good, then you're going to get to the top, right? And that was always, always, always going to be an issue because, you know, that ideology of the market of competition, it just papered over what were enduring, deep rooted inequalities that will take a very, very long time to root out. And you can't just like, you know, make them disappear by saying, oh, we're going to take some people from down here and put them up there. No, you have to dissolve those inequalities if you want to create a fair society. And the fact that we've all internalized this way of thinking is why people are hyper stressed at work. It's why, you know, they're like have all these health issues because they're competing with each other all the time. It's why people in, you know, left behind working class areas are like, firstly, deep down, I feel shitty about myself because I can't provide for my family and I wasn't able to escape this place. And that then morphs into this rage that is legitimately in some ways directed against this elite. And it all comes down to this idea, which was really spread by people at the top, that we can't work together. We have to be competing with each other. And if you fail, it's your own fault. And that is how neoliberalism works, is by telling us that our failures are our own personal fault. And the way the education system designed is such a really like key part of that.
I can't speak for the UK, Grace, but for the American education system, especially the American public education system, they're not up to snuff. I think the teachers feel overwhelmed. The kids are often not prepared, especially the lower down the income ladder they come. And then if you can't afford private school, you send your kid to a private school. So you're already, I'm saying this like as a twist on what you said, like the wheat is already being separated from the chaff. It's just being done automatically, which is we're up here, you're down there, you stay down there, which I want to bring in somebody who, Evelyn, you and I talked about, which is this Curtis Yarvin guy, who sort of says we should have a caste system. But you could make an argument we already do in too many places. Like it's already developed. Like he's a nut, don't get me wrong. If you haven't watched the Peter Thiel interview, don't. I did. I'm going to write something up on it. But talk about kooky, right? But they're of the same mindset, which is like, you are where you are. Good luck. The very smart and the very deserving will go to the top, and everybody else should just be happy with their place in society.
Well, Marx would call that the power of ideology, right? That it keeps people in line and it creates this sort of narrative where it's not like you don't need like tanks in the street to enforce this elite rule. You just need this psychological idea that this is natural. This is how the world is. Capitalism is like the way that, you know, the air we breathe. There's no alternative. But I think the really interesting thing about meritocracy too is that it's not just the losers that are suffering, it's also the winners in a way. It's the people who went to college, you know, are now in a market where there's either no jobs are precarious, they're sort of in this gig economy, and they're also feeling this, I think, extreme sense of like despair. Is this all there is in life, right? Am I just supposed to go work for a corporation for 40 years, collect a paycheck, have fun on the weekends, and do this so that, you know, they basically have to do it in the US at least so they can have a child and take time off so they can get healthcare. It's very much like an unfreedom. And I don't think that's really acknowledged at all. And I think that that's a big problem for the liberals, right? Because this is the class that they have decided is now their base. The liberals in America at least have shifted in like the late 70s and 80s from being a party of workers to being a party of this like elite professional class. I mean, I talk about this all the time amongst like my friends and stuff. There's this feeling that there has to be more to life than this sort of capitalist dream.
Which is really not a dream anymore.
Right. And I think the liberals have no language for this either. They have no language for like interdependence, what it means to have a relationship with my neighbor, what it means to have time to yourself, what it means to feel like belonging in a community. The idea is that you move to a big city, you live with like-minded people, and you work. And I think that this is all like needs to be acknowledged at least. So there's more of a framework for understanding just what the system has done for like the quote unquote winners of meritocracy and why it doesn't even work for the people that it's supposed to benefit in a lot of ways.
Evelyn brought up something interesting. So I'm sure you've seen some of these, either sometimes they're real Zoom videos or sometimes they're sort of send-ups of somebody who's an employee talking to their manager. And they're like, okay, we need you at work at 5:00 on Sunday. And the employee's like, no, I'm not doing that. And they're like, but you have to. And she's like, no, I don't. My job is from 9 to 5. That's what you pay me for. That's what you're going to get. And I'll be honest, when I first saw that, I'm like, what? I worked for years as an intern and for free, and I got my ass kicked and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, we had to do that. It was like an unspoken thing. You had to go do stuff like that.
Right. But now I'm like, I understand it. Like if I'm 28 and I'm in this job and it's basically doing PowerPoint decks all day and somebody's like, you got to show up at 5 on Sunday. I'm like, can you fire me if I don't show up? No. Then I'll see you on Monday morning. Maybe it's a social consciousness, which is, to Evelyn's point, I'm not happy being a cog in a shitty corporate machine.
It's also like the hope that you would once have been able to give that employee, which was one day you will be a director and you will have a nice house and you will have enough time to look after your family, is gone, right? That whole model was premised on basically a bubble in the American economy, which was, from like the 70s onwards, you have massive globalization, you have globalization of finance, you have massive inflows, as we've already talked about, of funds into the housing market. You had a big expansion of people being able to afford homes. And there was this like very clear ladder, which was like, you come in, your company is constantly growing, constantly becoming more profitable. At some point, you're able to get a mortgage and buy a house. Your house is going to be constantly increasing in value. You put some of your money into a pension. Your pension is going to be constantly increasing in value. And by the time you retire, you've worked really hard, sure, but you have a lot to show for it. And that is just not the case. It's not going to be the case for young people anymore, right? Firstly, that housing bubble, over. Like, if you can afford a house now, it's not going to increase in value by like, double over the course of the next 20 years. It's just never going to happen again. This was a once in a lifetime thing. Pensions, completely screwed. The whole pension system, nobody's going to have enough money to live a decent life when they're older based on current rates of saving now. And then corporate culture has become awful. Like, you're working extremely long hours for little pay because, again, pay hasn't been keeping up with inflation. So you're being sold this vision of work really hard to get basically nothing just to survive. And then you get to the point of, if you do finally make that next leap of realizing, okay, this company literally just exists to extract from me, you're going to be like, no, I'm going to do the minimum I need to do to survive. And that's, enough. That's more than enough. That's more than what I want to do. And it's really interesting, actually, Reed, because it speaks to kind of what you were saying about like valuing and devaluing work, right? Because we have a really like messed up view of what work is. And to the extent that people are like quiet quitting, they're quiet quitting in jobs where they're basically sitting around all day being told what to do. And that is not dignified work. Most of the jobs, most of the work we do is not dignified, right? But people still want to be able to do dignified work. They want to be able to care for themselves and each other. They want to be able to like care for their community. And, when people are given the opportunity to like invest in working to like clean up their local area or like support their public library and stuff, you see like communities suddenly coming together and around like a particular project, and everyone's like, I feel so like alive. I feel so part of something. I'm like so happy in doing this, right? So this kind of really alienated form of work is not something that people want to dedicate their lives to, but they don't have many other opportunities because of what you were saying, Evelyn, about like the decline of community, the kind of breakdown of these social bonds that the right has a really compelling language for, which is a highly conservative, small c conservative language, which is basically the problem is that people have become too individuated. It's kind of like a critique of capitalism from within capitalism. They're like, we need to keep everything the same at the top, but actually put the menace of like individual freedom back into the box. And women need to go back and be trad wives because they'll be happier, right? And it's because you're so miserable in your job, you're going to be happier if you're a trad wife. Or like we need, pure societies where we're all the same color and we all, come from the same place so that we can all get along, right? And it speaks to this like this challenge that people face in their lives, which is this absence of community, this absence of security, and it prescribes something worse, which is like going back to pre-freedom, right? Before you had the chance to be able to like figure out who you are as a person. And the fact that the left doesn't have a language for this, because we're scared of talking about community and meaning, I guess, is I think a real problem.
This was very obvious when J.D. Vance gave a speech accepting the nomination, where he literally says, I want to be buried alongside 7 generations of my family in this like Eastern Kentucky rural area.
He does not. Let's be very clear about that.
Also, doesn't he have a really shitty family?
Yes.
Like, isn't that what he wrote his book about?
Right. But this is the narrative that he came up with that I think works really well, right? And it's so coded to say, like, you deserve to live in the community where you grew up. You deserve to have a life, a dignified life that has been taken away in a lot of these places where you can, start a local business and sell to your neighbors and have this sense of community.
Almost sounds like he's been reading Grace's books.
Yeah, right.
To your point, Grace, like this is the language that they have that's so effective. And like the liberals, Kamala Harris's campaign just called him they called him weird and they made a bunch of memes about it and stuff. It really shows that this was a successful narrative and they're tapping into this idea about belonging and national identity. And I think that in order to have like a campaign where people buy in, and in the past, like FDR and stuff, you have a national project or some sort of national thing to rally around. It's like this metaphysical thing in a way that our politics has seemed to have lost, where people actually feel like seen and recognized.
Grace, the one thing, I can't speak for the conservatives in the UK. I think largely, I'm just assuming, I could be wrong here, that the conservatives and Labor still generally have a similar conversation about things. There are still things that are probably, I mean, maybe they want to do things differently, but here in the US, it's like Democrats are like, everything's fine. And Republicans are like, Mars is going to explode and we're all going to die. Like, it's just the two things don't ever mix, right? But the thing that the right in this country has done alongside, whether or not it was, Friedrich Hayek on a mountaintop in Switzerland or then shareholder value, is that they very much brought an economic and cultural, strands along with one another for the last 30 or 40 years. But also, where do conservatives congregate? Church, right? The right-wing organizations like a Turning Point USA, they have like 14 events a year. All over the place. They're on college campuses all over the place. They are going into Latino communities here in the U.S., recruiting young men and going to like his sister's quinceañera, where they know they're culturally adept enough to know that you bring gifts for the parents, not for the girl, but for the parents. And the left has none of that, right? They have none of that. It's almost as if they've said, to your point about atomization, live however you want. Community is unnecessary so long as you have this, unfettered version of whatever freedom is. But it turns out to be freedom without a net almost. I don't know. I don't even know what I'm trying to say, but it seems like, to Evelyn's point, that as twisted as it can be, and for their purposes it is, that the right understands the nature and importance of community. And the left is like, where there's more of us than there are of them, and we're smart enough and people will vote for us.
I actually think that this is true of a lot of parts of, particularly like, okay, the establishment left, or like liberals basically, and like the online left, right? Where that isn't any effort really to try and bring people together or build community or like bridge across divides. But I don't think it's true of most people who believe in like left-wing things. And like I have, good evidence for that in the sense of having spent, as part of the research I'm doing for my next book, just looking at like what people are doing when they see problems in their community, problems in the economy, and they say, actually, I'm going to do something about this. And there's lots of really cool examples of this. So whether that's like workers starting their own union, which have had loads of examples of in the US, like with Starbucks.
At Amazon, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Whether it is communities coming together and fighting for housing justice and starting a tenants union, right? That's something that's happening a lot across the UK. I know that you guys have Acorn in the US as well, which is doing similar sort of stuff. It can be campaigns to like, set up a local cooperative. I've seen loads of these really interesting campaigns of places where there's food poverty, but like agriculture, where people have come together and decided to set up a local food cooperative where everyone in the community is a member and they get discounted food, particularly for low-income families. I've just like got all of these incredible examples of ordinary people just being like, I'm so sick of being made promises by politicians who just ignore me whenever it's not election time and then knock on my door telling me to vote once every 4 years. If I'm going to do anything to change things, it's actually going to start right here, right now in my community. And you also see this as well in like bigger, it's not just like local community stuff, it's also like bigger struggles that are taking place. So like, for example, in the UK, protest movements of people who are like so angry about what's going on in Palestine. And so they come together and they fight back against that, only to be like, basically told you're not allowed to protest by our political elites. And, there are lots of different groups that are really trying to come together and actually meet and discuss and do things in person as a form of kind of real embodied politics. And one of the best examples I have of like where this can ultimately lead comes from Belgium. So small Northern European country, not probably in the headlines very much for politics, but they have a party, which is basically the Belgian Workers' Party, the former Communist Party, that reinvented itself and was basically like, we need to kind of cast off a lot of this old stuff that had been like dragging us down and figure out a way to build power in communities, fight the far right, and organize workers. And they've been astonishingly successful. How have they done that? They are very active within the labor movement. So they have strong links with workers. They use those links within the labor movement to back a few years ago, a group of people within the PTB set up these workers' health initiatives where basically doctors who are members of the party would go into communities and find like working class, often unionized workers who are suffering from health complaints and just treat them for free. And then say, oh, by the way, this issue is also an occupational hazard that comes from this particular area of your job. Have you considered organizing? The last thing that they were doing when I was speaking to them was going into neighborhoods where there was known to be a large far right presence and holding these barbecues amongst like trusted members of the community and getting them to invite their friends who they know were like maybe thinking about voting for the far right, and then just having a conversation. They did something as well where in one local area where the local pool was going to get shut down, which is where all these kids were learning to swim. So they staged a swim-in where they got all the kids into the pool and said, we don't shut down this pool, right? This is just like basic bread and butter stuff, and it's won them significant support. Bear in mind, this is a former communist party, right? So, there's lots of scary stuff that you can say about these guys. But just from doing work, building power in communities and talking to people and meeting them where they are, they've like shown that this alternative model of politics is something that you can not just have in a community, but like translate into electoral politics as well.
I mean, I'm just 3 weeks off the road. I was in small towns in New Jersey and Pennsylvania and Virginia this last couple of weeks, right? Places that most people, especially political types, never go. And that's the reason, Grace, I go there, because I don't want to hear them intermediated with whatever political bullshit. I want to go see and hear for myself. And it turns out that, the folks I met in a place like Suffolk County, Virginia, deep southeastern Virginia, they are not looking for a yacht, right? Like, they're not looking for that. They're looking for, like, how do I not have to worry about tomorrow, right? How do I not have to worry about, whether or not I eat or my kid eats, but not both of us can eat? And again, that's not an unreasonable thing. And when you put that in front of people, they don't find it unreasonable either. And Evelyn, it's been a while, but for years, there would be minimum wage referenda on the ballot in red states. Like, I think Nebraska is the last one I can remember. And it passes with flying colors, right? When disintermediated from a political party, people are like, yeah, I dig that. We should do that. That seems like it makes sense because we live in Nebraska and we're not assholes. But as soon as you put it to a place, well, do you know what it's going to do to small businesses? You don't care about small businesses, right? You've been holding up small businesses for the better part of 50 or 60 years. And every time you have the opportunity to help them, you don't. Right? Every time you have help them make more of what they do, if it's a service job or a manufacturing job, that you could do something for workers outside of the employment lane, you say, no, we can't do that. And so it becomes this catch-22 where, again, what we've been talking about is the idea of keeping people in stasis, ultimately, which is just hold them in place, because if we can hold them in place, then we can do what we're going to do.
Yeah, and if you can convince people that the current order is the inevitable order and that nothing's going to change, you have to ask who that serves, right? That serves the people in power. And so I think it's important, like what Grace was saying, to reject that and to learn and find ways to think in a way that's very structural. And this is the way that sort of this elite class doesn't want you to think, right? I was watching the coverage of Johnny's, he's like on a media blitz doing all these interviews with mainstream kind of liberal media. And every single one of them asks, how are you going to pay for that? Right. But that is such a selective question.
Or it's an intifada question or anything.
Right. Their bias is so on display in moments like that, where you think that this is a whole apparatus. It's the pundits, it's the liberal TV networks, it's the donor class, it's the Democratic establishment, who have this kind of unspoken agreement that we're not going to, rattle the boat too much, and we're all going to support each other in upholding this ideology that serves them. So I think that one step is rejecting that. And that's what I've written a lot about with these protests, where I think that people are only given the option, at least in the US, we have this like no King's Day protests, where first off, the idea that there's no kings in America is absurd, right? Like, if you just project Trump as the only king, that serves this narrative that like Trump is bad, the system is otherwise good. And so we have to ask ultimately who these narratives serve. And if we can build power outside of that, that is what is the greatest threat to the people in power. And I think that is the only way that we get out of this.
I've been thinking about this a fair bit, which is this idea of holding a couple of thoughts in your head simultaneously. So occasionally I listen to Steve Bannon's podcast. And I do it because I'm interested in what he's telling his people, and he's got a lot of people. And earlier this week, he said something that, I'll be honest, floored me. He said, you can believe that we don't need to do all we do for Israel and not be an anti-Semite. You can believe that the government of Iran is evil and not be anti-Muslim. Don't let people shut down that conversation. And I'm thinking to myself, Grace, when Steve Bannon is the one saying that, like, where's the world going? And this is something Evelyn and I talked about, like, which is, and I'm sure you've read it and we've seen the books, the post-liberal era, which is none of this makes sense. You've got Bannon, who I revile and I don't think is a good actor, right? He's a Leninist, VI, not John, right? And who says, like, burn it all to the ground and like, we'll recreate it in something I don't want. But sometimes when I find someone who came up in the establishmentiest part of establishment Republican politics that, like, why is Steve Bannon making sense? Why is he making sense on something like that?
And you see it, there was another interview with two guys, and is it Tucker Carlson?
Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz, yeah.
And Ted Cruz, that was the one. And the all the memes that came out of that interview.
Right. And Tucker has a special place in his heart for Cruz, so he's always hated him, right? So, and he's eminently hateable, don't get me wrong.
It was just interesting to watch, right? And I do think that there's certainly a class of that type of Republican which I would say is not an establishment Republican, as in like not someone who is part of the kind of traditional hierarchy of the Republican Party. So someone like Steve Bannon, for example, people who are closely allied with Donald Trump, who realize that the house is on fire. Like their whole message is rapidly falling apart. Obviously, you know, the big reality check came when the bond market started to say to Donald Trump, well, you can't just tariff the whole world and then hope for things to be better, right? That was their kind of initial shock moment of, okay, we're not going to be able to do some of the things that we thought we were going to do. Oh, and by the way, I said that I was going to talk about this earlier, you know, this idea that the kind of anti-globalization proposals that Trump is pushing, people are like, oh, well, surely he's acting against the interests of the capitalist class. No, you really have to understand this. And I wrote a piece that I'll send to you, Reed. You have to understand this kind of pushback against globalization as a pushback against Chinese technological hegemony. Basically, whoever controls the world's technology, whoever is producing that technology, whoever has that intellectual property, controls the capitalist world system. Ultimately, they translate that technological power into economic power. It's only a matter of time before that technological supremacy translates into military, economic, you know, all those other forms of dominance. Trump knows that. He's trying to take out China as a technological hegemon by cutting off access to chips, to all of the things that it needs to continue to produce in those like advanced manufacturing and technological spaces. That's why it's in the interest of American capitalists, right? And so the interesting thing is that we're seeing this splinter between American capitalism and global capitalism. Like coming back to that point of, okay, Republicans realizing their strategy isn't working. Their economic strategy, for that reason, has stopped working because they realize they can't tariff the world. Their rhetorical strategy on foreign policy, which was basically this kind of, they've stuck themselves in this kind of isolationist tradition of, we need to look after our own. It's better if we don't go bombing everyone and we just kind of stick to what matters for America. And that comes with isolationism in the form of foreign policy, also in the form of like kicking out immigrants, whatever. And the fact that they've been so quickly and easily dragged into, you know, what could have been the opening phases of World War III is again like the mask is slipping. You know, it's become clear that the people with this anti-elitist message who are like, we hate the traditional Republicans, we hate, you know, the deep state, whatever, they're literally the same. They just like have, as you say, Evelyn, different vibes. They speak a little bit differently and like, you know, less coherently a lot of the time, but ultimately they're in the same boat.
I was just going to say really quick about Steve Bannon that I think is so interesting is that he represents like the small faction of Trump's coalition that's actually kind of populist, like not just rhetorically, but actually what he believes, right? Steve Bannon wanted to increase the corporate tax rate last time and got shut out because of that. He likes Lena Khan. He likes the antitrust stuff. So he's like kind of the closest we have towards sort of like this leftist Trump. And there's a couple other people in that coalition. I think JD Vance is part of that tradition in a way. Senator Josh Hawley is part of that.
These are all people who are like angry losers almost, by the way, who feel like they've been over.
Yeah, I call them the you white guys.
Yeah. And so they have this kind of strain of like populism. But as you said earlier, Grace, like JD Vance especially, it's this very like homogeneous, nationalist, racially coded version of whatever this all is. So there's this social aspect to it that's also quite scary. But I think that they actually do have some of the populists where Trump is just a populist and kind of rhetoric only. These people have this inkling of wanting to do some sort of economic policy, which makes it the dynamic really interesting to watch.
So, guys, where do we go from here? Because as you both just noted, the neoliberals don't want to let go. And Grace, as you noted, it was almost seamless for the neoconservatives. So neoliberal, neoconservative, right? Both interested in sort of the same thing, which is power. One's desperately trying to maintain control. The other one was happy to have it back for just a moment, if it was just 2 bombing runs over Iran. So how do we go from here? Because Grace, one thing you said, and I 100% agree, and I'm trying to practice, not just preach, is we have to get back to this in person. I really am 100% committed to the idea we have to get back to in person. I think Zoom is fine, but it's not the same. 2 dimensions is not the same as 3 dimensions. That third dimension of being in space with another human, the friction, and I use that in a good way, not a bad way, of people being together. I almost call it Velcro, of people being together, I think is essential. So how do we start to change that conversation away from 50, 60, 70 years of neoliberalism economically, neoconservatism foreign policy wise or militarily, to something that makes sense in 2025 in a post-industrial America, in a post-industrial UK, in a post-COVID world? Like, where do we go from here?
I think the point I've come to is just being able to say, as the left generally, or just as a person, politicians aren't coming to save you, right? We can't rely on the fact that there's going to be someone and like 10 million other Zorans to get elected everywhere else who are going to suddenly change politics for all of us. We have to start doing this stuff and building this stuff right now, everywhere. So it really requires us to dramatically expand our conception of what politics is. We can't rely on politicians to do politics for us. Because, half the time they're not even doing politics. They're pretending to do politics whilst serving the interests of a billionaire class. So how do we do politics? Well, it involves shifting power. One of those things, I put out a video the other day, which was under the headline of "Make Yourselves Ungovernable," which I think is really important. It's like breaking out of these psychological and, to an extent, material confines that we've been placed under, which are like, we have to compete with everyone around us. We can't collaborate. I don't know what a union is. I've never spoken to anyone else in my community, taking responsibility for all of your own issues. All of that has to go. And we have to be supportive of each other whilst also being grit in the wheels of this machine. So making it harder for everything to work whilst creating the networks and the bonds of solidarity that are required to allow us to do that. So yeah, that does mean things like, if you are in a company that has a union, joining a union. If you're not, think about how you could start a union. And that applies to you even if you are a professional worker that thinks, I want to compete to climb up the greasy pole. Stop thinking that way. It applies to thinking about, how you can take initiative in your community, which could be everything from helping with a local food bank to starting a tenants union or whatever. Actually doing politics in your local area by coming together with other people to take on the interests of those who are trying to exploit you or screw you over, whether that's a powerful politician or a big corporate boss or whatever. So that thing of building solidarity whilst making ourselves ungovernable is, I think, the prerequisite to any form of electoral political change. Because I'm not saying that everything changes with just doing that. We need to elect politicians to do good things, right? To take on the interests of these billionaires and to get into the machinery of the state and start messing that up as well. But that's not going to happen if we can't start by building these kinds of social bonds. A lot of the reason that Mamdani did so well was that he was able to go to neighborhoods that still had social bonds and social capital, and where he could come together and speak to groups of people who trusted each other and say, what do you guys want? And they could have a conversation, right? And that is generally the case where these progressive politicians get elected at a local level. It's that they're able to engage with pre-existing social groups and social bonds. And a lot of those, by the way, are from immigrant communities, second, third, fourth generation immigrant communities that have held themselves together more effectively than other parts of the city. So how can we start building out those bonds in other places and coming together to create the kind of solidarity that we need, not just to build a different kind of politics, but to actually help each other in what is a very scary point in time. So yeah, and I think if we do that, then if we change our lives and if we change the way we think about politics and each other, then the politics will change too.
Evelyn, finish us off here.
Well, it's hard to build off that. I'll just say one thing. David Foster Wallace, who I love, gave a beautiful speech where he talked about the sort of the most important thing that we have is our ability to maintain and choose what we think about, this awareness that we have. And I think that in addition to doing sort of the more material things of getting out and being in community with other people, we also have this ability psychologically to question the dominant narratives and ask who power is serving, right? And how we can just start to dismantle that. And so I think looking at these institutions more critically, not taking what the people in power say at their word, but looking at who it serves, are ways that we can all kind of psychologically start to dismantle a lot of these systems that are not serving people's interests and will ultimately build a more sustainable, more human politics.
This is something that I'm going to have a conversation with a couple of people about next week, so stay tuned for that. And Evelyn, you and I have talked a fair bit about this, are the anti-Trump and never Trump people, like, what happens when he's gone? Do they go back to where they came from?
That's why they're so focused on him as a singular villain, right? Because as long as he's there, it works. Their story holds.
Yeah, but if he's gone, right, then what's your story?
Then we're going to have to reckon with the conditions that brought him to power.
Right. And of course, they'd prefer obviously to ignore that.
They prefer to have him. So it's also kind of, in a cynical way, it's in their interest to keep Trump around.
Right. Which cynicism abounds at the elite level. I can promise you that. All right. Ladies, before I let you go, Grace, where can everybody find you online? Where can they find your work?
You can find me just at Grace Blakeley on Instagram, on Substack. You can find me on X. I don't really use it that much anymore. Mainly Instagram and Substack. And if you want to support my work, that's the best place to do it. You can also buy my book, Vulture Capitalism. This is the US version with a nice American flag on the front in all good bookstores.
It is an excellent book. I killed a highlighter on it. It's a wonderful book. Please read it.
Yeah, I read it too. It was great.
All right, Evelyn, how about you?
I'm mostly just on Substack. I think it's Quartz Evelyn. Same on Blue Sky and Twitter as well.
All right. As always, gang, you can find me on Twitter, TikTok, at says.us, at Reed Galen on Threads, and Instagram at Reed_Galen USA, and also on Substack, either at Reed Galen or The Homefront. Grace, Evelyn, thank you so much for taking so much time with me. Thank you for this conversation. I hope it is the first of many.
Thanks, Reed.
Thanks for having us.
Everybody else, we'll see you next time.